Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and today we welcome back Katelyn Jetelina, publisher of Your Local Epidemiologist, to talk about updates in COVID research. We discuss the effectiveness of the most recently updated COVID vaccines against severe disease and long COVID, how people can think about their risks of getting COVID, what we know about when you might be most infectious, seasonality, and more. Let's listen. Katelyn Jetelina, thank you so much for coming back onto Public Health on Call. It's good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. Excited to be here.
So today we're going to talk about COVID, actually. You recently sent out a COVID research roundup through your email, Your Local Epidemiologist. We're 4 years into this, and there's still ongoing research that's helping us better understand infections. We're also watching these things change in real time. So we're just going to go through an overview today of where we are on some key points. Let's start with the updated COVID vaccines, the ones that we all got in the fall. What do we know about these vaccines?
Or hopefully got. Our uptake isn't too great.
I know.
So with the COVID vaccine, we really took the flu model in that we have to have a proactive response to try to get ahead of this vaccine. We kind of have to guess where it's going. And because of that, we're dependent on some lab data and some human data to make that decision for the formula for example, the 2023 fall formula for the COVID vaccine. We didn't have, for example, real-world data or clinical trial efficacy data. As much as we would like that, it's just not feasible in the time frame. So our vaccine effectiveness data is finally starting to roll in, and it's looking really promising. So, for example, one study found a 70% additional effectiveness against hospitalization in the Netherlands among those over 60. Another study found added protection for at least 30 days. This is not a big surprise because we know how antibodies work. We know how our immune system works. But I think what this does provide is additional confidence that it is providing protection.
What do we know about protection against the latest variant?
We don't know much. So I think you're talking about JN1. JN1 is still one SARS-CoV-2. So we are very confident that these vaccines still protect against hospitalization and death. I think the question is, how well does it protect against the short-term window against infection as well as transmission? And what we've seen in the lab data is that effectiveness has decreased a little because of JN1, but not completely. So these vaccines still help to some degree, but really for its primary purpose of severe disease are working great.
And what do we know about how these vaccines are protecting against long COVID, or do we know anything yet?
We do. So we have gotten some really great data lately about that long COVID is providing incremental benefit with the number of doses. And in epidemiology and public health, I don't know if I have to tell this audience, but this is called a dose-response relationship. So one vaccine reduces risk by a little, 2 doses reduces it by a little more, 3 doses reduces it by even more, about 73% effectiveness. And we see this with adults as well as kids. And so as a parent, it really makes me feel a little better that when I get them the updated COVID-19 vaccines, it also protects them against long COVID, which honestly is one of my biggest concerns these days instead of severe disease.
I think that's a lot of people's concerns. And to that end, more research has come out now that can help people make some calculations about their risks of getting COVID in certain situations. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's right. So there was a fantastic transmission study that came out, and I wish we had more of these, but they're really hard to conduct, honestly. But what they found was that our risk is, or the risk of transmission is basically a simple formula of time times proximity. So the more time you're with an infected person, for example, in a household, or the closer you are to someone, for example, I don't know, a dentist working very closely into someone's teeth really impacts transmission. And I think this helps us make risk calculations, which is so hard to do. But for example, should you wear a mask going to the grocery store when it's empty on a Saturday morning compared to staying at home with someone infected? Those risks are very different. And I think formula like this can be helpful. At least it is to me.
Well, you also talk about, we know a little bit more about when you might be the most infectious. And it looks like it's happening a little bit later than we thought. So, how does that play into this calculation?
This has been so annoying because it's changed over time. So, in the beginning of the pandemic, you were most infectious about day one or day two after infection. And this is kind of like the flu. However, as our immunity has changed, as this virus has changed, this is delayed into the third, fourth, fifth day, which is really challenging because one, this is a long time, for example, to miss school, to miss work. But also, this has made the utility of our antigen tests come into question because this means that you're more likely to have a false negative, which may tell people that they think they don't have COVID when they really do, and it's delayed. And so, this is really added kink in the story of SARS-CoV-2 and how we can use our tools to best protect ourselves and the people around us.
Does that come into play at all with recommendations that, okay, so when we're talking about day one, are we talking about the first day that you notice symptoms, and then like the recommendation is 5 days, you're sort of isolated from other people when you have symptoms. And then maybe the next 5 days, you're wearing a mask if you have to be out among people. Where does this new information fall?
That is a highly debated question right now among scientists. And I know that this has been on the top of minds at CDC, for example, is do we change infection or isolation guidelines to shorter, like we do with the flu, or longer? And not only what does the science say, but how can we best implement this to 330 million people? And one, that they'll do it, and two, that they'll listen, and three, that it is scientifically correct. And this has kind of been the challenge of COVID-19 policy throughout the pandemic. I think that bottom line, at least how I'm thinking about it, is a negative antigen test, once it's turned positive, is the best indicator that you're no longer infectious. And if you have symptoms right now, we're at the height of respiratory season, whether it's for COVID or RSV or flu or whatever, you need to stay home. It doesn't really matter for us healthy people. Where this does really matter, and I don't know the answer to this, is use with Paxlovid, for example. So you need to have Paxlovid within the first 5 days of symptoms. But if you don't get a positive test until day 5, that doesn't give you much time to get a prescription. And so I'd be very curious to hear going forward the conversation among clinicians on how they view a required positive test for a Paxlovid prescription for the highest of highest risk. And I don't think that conversation's really played out yet, and I'm looking forward to it in the coming months.
And so just to clarify, you would view that once you have a positive COVID test, you would sort of start the timer then?
No, so typically it's the day you get symptoms. So for example, you start feeling your nose running, or the first day. Ideally, it would be the day of exposure, but we don't know that for the vast majority of people. So we use a proxy of first day of symptoms and then count forward to that.
Got it. Okay. So if you are still testing positive on, let's say, day 6 or 7 after symptoms, maybe you consider wearing a mask, maybe you consider still isolating depending on your circumstances. Is that what you would recommend?
That's exactly what I'm doing, to be perfectly honest. Yeah. So what antigen tests are really good at is telling us when we're positive. And they're also a very good proxy to tell us how infectious we are. And so I think that's the best tool we have going forward.
What do we know about seasonality with COVID?
Yeah, seasonality. So typically, I'll say viruses are sensitive to temperatures. And this is usually what kind of explains or drives our respiratory season. Other coronaviruses are susceptible to temperature changes, common flu, the common cold. So we kind of assumed that SARS-CoV-2 was also sensitive to temperatures, but a recent animal study suggested it's not driven by temperature humidity changes, which is actually incredibly surprising. This means that COVID-19 remains capable of transmission under cold weather, under hot weather, and also under a range of humidity conditions. The implications for this are not so great because what it means is that we will probably continue to see multiple waves per year. So, what drives this is human behavior. So, for example, us going on holiday and opening up our social networks. And then, two, the rate in which this virus is mutating. And it's still mutating about 2 to 3 times faster than the flu right now, which means that we're probably going to get multiple waves of infection, which is just not great news.
And all of this is part of a conversation that we haven't had on the podcast actually in a while. You've mentioned several times that the science hasn't quite caught up to policy. And then how do you create blanket policies for everyone when that's just not feasible? We know that a lot of employers, for example, have rolled back their policies around taking time off for COVID-19 or for caring for someone in your home that might have COVID-19. The broader conversation here is that the science on this is changing all the time and things may still change in the future. I think a lot of people have just figured like, okay, I get my vaccines. If I get sick, I isolate. What can we expect to see with research over the next, say, few years?
I think we're going to learn a lot, just particularly because this virus continues to change, right? I mean, we all like, oh, it's been 4 years of this pandemic. When is it ever going to end? But in a virus's lifetime, it's still incredibly new. And our knowledge is incredibly scant. And we're really dependent on time to help us figure this out. It's going to change. That's how science works. It continues to change. Two, I think it's really important to recognize that policy isn't just based on science. It's also based on morals, its values, psychology, political landscape. And so all of those things play a factor, including population fatigue around SARS-CoV-2 in the first place. And so our policy decisions today in January 2024 are going to be very different than they were in March of 2020, even if the virus didn't change very much. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. Three, the thing I'm really looking forward to is advancement in long COVID research, not just for those suffering from long COVID, but I hope that it will provide answers to this bigger array of very neglected research and knowledge around post-viral symptoms for other viruses as well. And so I think that's where our knowledge is really going to explode. And a transmission, antigen tests, how this virus is changing is just going to keep incrementally growing as we go.
Well, let's talk a little bit about long COVID. What do we know about the research now? Do we know a little bit more about who's at risk? Do we know, is this resolving in some people? Where are we?
Yeah, so long COVID, there's three big questions we're trying to answer is one, how many people actually get it? And this is a simple question, but really hard to answer. Two, what are the predictors? So who's more likely to get it? Because if we can find patterns, then that means that it's not random and it's preventable and treatable. And then third is what are treatment options? And so we've found some movement in all three of those in the research. For example, it actually looks like our prevalence is starting to decrease thanks to increased immunity. Predictors, yes, women are more likely to get it. Those with severe disease are more likely to get it. What we most recently found out is that low cortisol levels, you're more likely to get long COVID, which may suggest a possible clinical trial down the road. And then three with treatment is this is slow and this is frustrating because a lot of people need treatment right now. But we're starting to get clinical trial results slowly coming through. And so that means that unfortunately, clinically, treatment hasn't really changed. Physicians are still treating symptoms rather than the underlying cause. And I think that we really need to figure out what does work for patients or subsets of patients.
Final question for you. Do you have any big burning questions about COVID that you hope get answered soon?
Oh, I was not expecting this question. Honestly, the biggest thing that I have been really surprised about, but also curious about, is not necessarily the virus, not necessarily prevalence or incidence or continued waves, but really the intersection of epidemiology and behavior, and what our human collective response is with time and how that does change. And it's something that we're not taught necessarily in epidemiology, but it was such a big driving factor during this pandemic and continues to be, that it's absolutely fascinating to watch unfold in real time. And so I'm curious, what would get people to put on their mask again? What would create headlines and what wouldn't? And why are people still interested in it? What are their concerns and how can we help address those concerns is something I look forward to. So I don't think that really answered your question, but that is something that's been just absolutely fascinating to follow.
Well, we thank you for all the work that you've done with your local epidemiologist, because you certainly have made many of us feel more in the know with all of the data and all of the evidence that you compile. And you've certainly helped perhaps change some behavior. So, Katelyn, Jetelina, thank you so much for being back on Public Health on Call.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Ceciri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Ceciri and Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.